of implementation of that plan has the onus is on the private sector for 80%, while the budgeted part of that plan is about 20%. So we welcome you. Let me welcome you very warmly to this event. Time is of the essence in that the program, we are running a bit late. So at this stage, let me invite the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation to proceed with the presentation, then we'll discuss. Thank you. Welcome all.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we'll keep the session light on protocol. So please note that, especially when it comes to question time as well. So I'll proceed with the Minister's presentation on the MTEF. There's still a lot of... Hello? Can we have one meeting, please? The 2024, this is a public consultative presentation on the draft 2024 to 2026 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. There is, a process this until the National Assembly actually passes it by resolution. It remains a work in process. So, that's why your comments, your observations, your input on this forum, I believe that there are people who are not able to join us physically, who are online. The input as well will be, helpful. Sorry, I'm trying to move this, but what's going on now? This thing was working just now.
Okay, do we go to that table? I think it's better. Let's go down.
Okay. All right. Just some introduction. This MTEF and FSP has been prepared against the backdrop of a recent democratic transition. The new administration is barely 4 months old, and nevertheless, it is to be expected that this will reflect not just current realities, but also the new direction of the administration. There are, of course, a number of critical factors that have impacted this. The Russia-Ukraine war, has had severe and continuing implications on global food and energy prices. We still have the challenges in domestic revenue mobilization, public debt sustainability concerns, elevated inflation, not just domestically, but in most economies, which has prompted monetary tightening, especially in the advanced economies, and that in itself has had negative impact on capital flows to emerging economies like ours. We still have a pretty challenging domestic macroeconomic and business environment, whether it's to do with infrastructure, foreign exchange, and logistics, management, whatever. And then we still have a lingering negative impact of insecurity across, the country. So all of these are factors that, affect the medium-term outlook. But the goal of this is to present a clear picture of the current situation, as well as medium-term outlook of the Nigerian economy. we have tried to be as conservative as possible in looking at this so that, as we expect, the outcome will be better than this, and the picture shown here. But the goal, of course, over the medium term is to accelerate the rate of inclusive economic growth and prosperity in tandem with the renewed hope agenda of this administration. The new administration's goals for economic growth are, so to say, more ambitious than what is reflected in the underpinning medium-term development plan 2021 to 2025. Nevertheless, there is an ongoing process to review that plan so we can dimension the necessary policies, legislation, institutional changes, additional resources that will be required to basically give life to that loftier growth ambition. Okay? So this framework, of course, will form the basis for the budget, and the resource allocation that the budget will reflect. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Trying to synchronize. Okay. The economy continues to post growth, but then growth is still not at the level that we desire. As of the second quarter this year, was 2.51%. Okay, and meanwhile, our target for full year is 3.75%. But the good news here is that the growth so far was driven largely by the non-oil sector, because the oil sector has performed poorly. Globally also, we see challenges in most economies. The IMF has recently, in its most recent World Economic Outlook, has projected that the global economy will grow by 3% in 2023, down from 3.5%. And at the previous quarter, they projected that it will stay at 3% even in 2024, but the new projection is for a decline to 2.9% in 2024. So let's see how 2022 fared. In 2022, we had an oil price benchmark. $73 was what we projected. We actually closed the year with $103.87. So there, the actual was significantly ahead of projection. But in terms of production, we projected an average of 1.6 million barrels per day, wound up with just 1.28 million barrels. I think the issues surrounding production have been generally discussed in the public space, so we're mostly familiar with that. Exchange rate, again, it's against 410 year average, and this we're talking about the official rate, and bear in mind we're talking about 2022. Inflation ended up substantially higher than what was projected and has maintained that upward trajectory. GDP growth, 3.1 as against 3.55 that was projected. Okay. In terms of the fiscal outturns, gross oil and gas revenues were about 2/3 of what was projected. Okay. And then this is largely explained by the lower than budget oil production as well as higher costs. PMS subsidy in 2022 cost the federation here, not the federal government, 4.1 trillion naira, as against 4 trillion naira that was provided for in the fiscal framework. Okay. So basically, this just shows how all of that. But if you see non-oil taxes, okay, 6.45 trillion, 7.02 trillion achieved. So non-oil taxes outperformed target. And if you decompose that in terms of how the two main non-oil taxes, CIT and VAT, performed, you see there both outperformed target, but CIT especially so. Customs duty, customs revenue about 14% below target. But all in all, overall, non-oil taxes, performed well. This just shows how this is distributed among the three tiers of government, based on the revenue sharing formula. But speaking about the federal government itself, apart from the share of federation revenues, because the federal government has its own independent, revenue sources. So all in all, the federal government, inclusive of its what we call the government-owned enterprises, okay, projected revenues of 9.97 trillion, we wound up with 8.81 trillion. So that was about 82% of the target. Again, oil was the main drag here. You can see oil revenues came in at just for 2022, 35% of the target. So that was really the drag, whereas non-oil revenues outperformed target. On the expenditure side, as against an aggregate planned expenditure of 18.14 trillion, government and its agencies spent 14.27 trillion, approximately 79% of the budget. And the underspending was largely correlated to the underperformance of the revenue side of the budget as well. Not surprisingly, recurrent expenditure, non-debt current spending was on target. Debt service, okay, exceeded, the budget, and that's, essentially because we saw significant increases in interest rate in the course of the year. Ways and Means was a particular contributor to that, because before the securitization of the Ways and Means balances, the central bank was charging, government MPR plus 1%. At a point, it was actually MPR plus 3%, which was quite, punitive, and that's largely contributory. And the process of securitizing that debt took much longer than had been projected. As is often the case, the capital expenditure took the bigger brunt of the lower than planned expenditure. Okay, so that takes us to 2023. These are the key benchmarks for 2023, and it shows how we have performed up to July this year. It's against an oil price budget benchmark of 75. Again, actual year to date is 80. And let me say this upfront, that the trend of budgeted oil prices coming in below actual is not accidental. We take a very conservative approach in projecting oil prices, because that's something that there's practically nothing we can do to affect. We're not sufficiently big producer to affect the prices. So we basically take a very conservative view of that. But again, you see that it appears to be another consistent trend where production actual comes in below, the budget. We tend to be less conservative around the projections for oil production because that's something that we can do something about. And a budget is a tool at the end of the day to drive fiscal performance in the desired direction. And so we tend to then require that the agencies and those who can do something about improving the production do it. And so in terms of exchange rate, again, given the gradual change in policy in the course of the year, you can see that reflected in the average exchange rate year to date. Inflation, as I said, has basically soared, and growth is still below target. In terms of the fiscal outturns, we see here oil revenues for the first 7 months of the year came in at approximately 76% of target. And it's noteworthy that if you looked at the picture at the end of the first quarter, it was much more dire. It was basically a dire outlook. But the 3 months up to July, following the removal of petrol subsidies and the reform in the foreign exchange market, basically contributed to significant improvement in performance of the oil sector, because subsidy was applied as an upfront net out from oil revenues before accounting to the Federation. So okay. This shows how Federation revenues have been distributed. But if we go now to the federal government itself, in terms of its revenue performance in the first 7 months, if you look at federal government only, okay, it's actually just 4% off the target. But when you then include the GOEs, okay, it's about 20% off target. So in terms of revenue performance in the first 7 months, haven't done too badly, and the expectation is that the remaining 5 months will show even a better, performance. So we think that we will, come very close, if not, fully achieve our revenue projections for, the year. On the expenditure side, inclusive of a supplementary budget of 819.5 billion naira that was approved in July by the President, total projected spending for the year now 22.6 trillion naira. So as of July, in aggregate, 65% pro rata of the spending had occurred. So spending is running significantly behind what was projected. Non-debt recurrent, again, typically is close to the the projections, but we see here some, because those tend to be largely non-discretionary spending. But on the discretionary spending side, things are, progressing a lot slower, some deliberately. On the capital expenditure side, we introduced a new approach to capital, to funding the capital expenditure this year. So rather than give agencies funding in advance of their procurement, they're now required to conclude the procurement and execution before they receive funding. So in the last, so you can see there, as of July, only about 34% of capital budget of MDAs had been released to them. But in the latter part of the year, we'll expect to see some catch up on that. That then takes us to, okay, in terms of the fiscal balance here, you see here, as against a pro rata deficit position of 6.8 trillion by July, we were actually 3.4 trillion. So basically 50% of the projected deficit. So the deficit is way behind what was. So we expect to finish the year with a deficit that is lower than what was projected. The deficit has been mostly funded by domestic foreign debt, but domestic debt predominantly thus far. A number of government is not unmindful of its fiscal challenges, and the number of them, the key ones that we highlight here and what we're doing about it, so that you can also appreciate where government is coming from. Government suffers from grossly inadequate revenues. Public revenue to GDP ratio, you can see there is at the bottom of the pack globally. And so we must do something, about this. So when government appears to be taking a fairly aggressive stance in terms of, taxation and stuff like that, you can appreciate where we're coming from. And unless we grow public sector revenues, we're going to still have a fiscally unsustainable situation. Okay. And these are some from the way we see it, the factors responsible for the low revenues. Low crude oil production, high production costs. 30 years ago, Nigeria was one of the lowest cost producers of hydrocarbons. Today, we are one of the highest cost producers. We need to be intentional about fixing that. Oil theft and insecurity in the oil producing, that has to be fixed, because some of the underproduction is related to to that. Federation areas in joint ventures, which has slowed down investment by the IOCs, that has to be resolved. And generally, the challenge of inadequate investment in the oil and gas sector needs to be, addressed. Weak actual tax collections compared to potential. Collection efficiency on most of the tax lines is under 50%. So that means there's significant room for improvement, not necessarily by increasing the rates, but by just getting more efficient about those, and technology is critical in this respect. We have an unchecked rise in tax expenditures. Tax expenditures refer to all of the tax waivers, the concessions, the tax holidays that government grants. We need to rein these in. For 2022, for instance, the estimate of tax expenditures is close to 3 trillion naira. Then, over the medium term, we have to face up to the reality of low tax rates in some respects. So our VAT rate, for instance, at 7.5% is actually below 50% of the average for the continent. So inevitably, over the medium term, we have to address some of these. We've temporarily suspended imposition of some, health, related taxes like the excise on sugar and sweetened beverages. But even the rate that we had proposed was below the regional average for such taxes. So over the medium term, we need to face up to these realities. Poor supervision of the government-owned enterprises and weak accountability framework, that's something that is being strengthened. And then, of course, improving our accounting for the fiscal flows. This is still dealing with the revenue, generation challenge here, Some just more specific things to do about, the oil and gas sector. Still some graphs. This then takes us to rising cost, the challenge of rising cost of governance and low spending efficiency. So government admits to this being a problem, cost of governance. And therefore, this needs to be, addressed. You can see here, the graph on the right side shows how the non-debt recurrent expenditure related to budget size has been, on an upward trajectory. On the other hand, we see the capital spending relative to the budget side not being on a consistent upward, trajectory. So this is another challenge that government is, dealing with. Okay. This again shows graphically what our actual expenditure vis-a-vis our budget. You see there, they're tracking each other, but from 2021, the gap even widened. So we must, close, this gap, and especially on the infrastructure side, while the needs continue to expand, the resources available continue to decline, and so government clearly needs to look at other more sustainable approaches to funding infrastructure investment. The World Bank reckons that if we stay at our current level of investment in public infrastructure, then it will take us 300 years to close the gap. But as you heard Mr. President this morning say, he said that, he'll rather work towards closing this gap in over 10 years than 300 years. So clearly, it's not acceptable. So just the point that we must accelerate. Okay. We also have low spending on the social sectors, and health and education illustrate this. We're spending way too little on a per capita basis on these two critical sectors. And when we talk about we here, we're not talking about just the federal government. This is actually, this chart illustrates all of government, the federal government and the state, governments in aggregate. Okay. So we have a few recommendations here that we are working on, and we hope that you can add to this list. Improve procurement practices, enhance discipline and sustainability in recurrent expenditures, especially personnel costs. Just raise the bar in terms of the criteria for admitting capital expenditure into the budget, and also, have a tighter regime around the pricing and costing of these. We believe that as we go into 2024, we need to achieve and sustain fully deregulated pricing of petroleum products and cost-reflective electricity tariffs. In 2023, we budgeted for just under 200 billion naira tariff shortfall expenditures, and government has been subsidizing electricity tariffs for consumers. We projected to spend under 200 billion around that. The most recent projections are multiples of that, because government had to prevail on NEC to suspend the tariff adjustment action that will have taken effect from July. But again, just like we've had to deal with the subsidy on petrol, we need to deal with the subsidy on electricity. If we're going to see investments come into the sector at the level that they should come, then we have to have cost-reflective, tariffs. We have the challenge of rising budget deficits and consequently rising, public debt. This chart shows from 2015 to 2023, okay, in out of those 9 years, the deficit to GDP ratio has exceeded the 3% threshold in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And you can see, look at that, the projection for 2023. This is based on the 2023 budget, but as I showed in the situation up to July, we're doing much better than projected, and so hopefully we won't get this high. But nonetheless, we need to deal with that. Okay. These are some of the measures that we are adopting to, address the challenge of rising budget deficits and consequently increasing public sector borrowings. Then let's go to the meat of our thing today, which is the proposed 2024 to 26 fiscal framework. As they say, you may not be able to do anything about the past, but the future you can. And so here we look to see, to receive your input in terms of what we can do. Here, again, in terms of some of the key benchmarks, oil price, we're looking at 73.96 for 2024, 73.76 for 25, and 69.9. Even though this is showing the 3-year medium-term outlook, I'll focus more on 2024, and I'm sure that for most of us, that's what immediately concerns us. Oil production, we're looking at 1.78 million barrels per day. Someone might say, but, you just showed us that as of July, you were under 1.4. Is this realistic? Two things. One, in terms of the technical capacity, we believe that it exists to do this and even more. In terms of OPEC quota, remember, this number includes condensates, which don't count in the OPEC quota. So in terms of quota, this is well within our OPEC quota. So we think that it's a realizable number, given all of the measures that are being taken, and really it's an existential issue for us. So government needs to do whatever needs to be done to get oil production up. Exchange rate for 2024, we're looking at 700 naira. Someone might say, how are you going to fix that, even where I&E window is? This is an average for 2024. And so we think that while at the initial stages it might be saying if the plans to stabilize the economy, to improve foreign exchange flows to the economy materialize, that this is this is feasible. But from a budget standpoint, we don't worry too much about this number, because if it turns out higher than this, then basically revenue outturns will be even better. In terms of inflation, again, given where we are today, someone will say, how are you projecting 21.4? 21.4% is how we estimate that next year will close. Again, that's feasible when you consider the base effect as we go into 2023 plus 2024 plus the CBN's, the new CBN management's avowed, goal of focusing on price stability and dealing with the rest. In terms of GDP growth, we're projecting 3.76% going into 2024. This just, references how it makes the point that the projections around oil price and not haphazard. We actually reference reliable sources, but we then, apply our own discount factors to reflect the conservative approach that I talked about earlier on. Okay. So for 2024, we, in terms of the federation, we project 24.5 trillion naira, up from 11.86 trillion in 2023. Okay, and the key drivers of this, the exchange rate effect, the higher oil production, the removal of petrol subsidy. These are basically the key drivers of this. Of course, there's also the improvement in revenue administration and higher collection efficiencies that we expect. I hope you can read this. It's a little tiny, but basically it just shows on a line basis how the federation account is built up and how it is distributed among the three tiers of government. For the federal government itself, for 2024, we project revenues at 16.96 trillion. That's 54% more than the 2023. But again, the same factors I stated earlier, the key drivers. In addition to that is the improved performance management framework for the GOEs. Recently, the federal government restructured the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, which is now actually going to drive most of government's investments in all of these GOEs is held through Murphy. But in the past, Murphy has operated as a passive investor. Now, Murphy is being skilled up and structured to actually then actively manage those investments and demand better performance. Another point to note here is that of this 16.96 trillion, 41% is projected to come from oil-related sources and 59% from non-oil sources. Again, this just shows on a line, item by item basis, the sources of the projected, revenue. On the expenditure side, we project aggregate expenditure of 26.01 trillion, which is 14.8% higher than 2023. Remember, the revenue was 54% higher. Expenditure is 15% higher. So again, the goal here being to cut down on deficit, the rate of deficit, and consequently borrowing. This just shows the major expenditure headings. That's what it shows here. One line worthy of attention here is the debt service line for 2024, growing to 8.25 trillion and maintaining an upward trajectory over the medium term because of the significant debt stock that we already carry. In terms of the fiscal balance, over this medium term, we still project to, at the current moment, these numbers still show, substantial fiscal deficit, albeit lower than the 2023 level over the medium term. However, as I pointed out earlier, there is an ongoing process to realign the higher ambitions of the new administration's agenda, the renewed hope agenda, with the medium-term, the goals and the targets stated in the medium-term development plan, which is the basis for these projections. And so as we get to the point where those can be translated into, numbers that we feel comfortable about, we would be revising these medium-term projections. So that's a process that is, ongoing. Because the goal of government is, over the medium term, to reduce the fiscal, deficit. Okay. Just a few concluding remarks. Okay. We believe that this framework, for now, represents a realistic, balanced, and forward-looking one. It sets the stage for inclusive growth, resilience, and sustainable development, and also attempts to address the key fiscal challenges. It basically then to strike a balance between fiscal prudence and supporting economic growth. Driving economic growth requires that government sustains expenditure. Government expenditure is a key driver of economic growth. But again, we need to do this in a manner that is, sustainable fiscally. Okay. Over the medium term, we should implement measures for revenue diversification, improve tax administration, and basically to reduce the dependency on volatile revenue sources and debt. Okay, so government continues to keep its eye on the debt and debt sustainability issues, and there is a determination to make sure that over the medium term and beyond that public debt remains at sustainable levels. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll take questions and answer. We've had a very clear presentation with details as it should be. And so we'll take some questions. We have questions online, and we have some fiscal questions as well. If you have a fiscal question, we'll request that you please raise your hand. And the process of asking the question should be direct. You would say your name, where you represent, and please just go straight to the question so we can keep to time.
Sorry not to interrupt you. Before the questions from the press, this is public consultation with the private sector stakeholders. We would like to hear from, if there's any observations or comments from the distinguished audience here. The budget and the MTF, then from it, the subsequent budget, that is where the tire hits the road on all these economic plan. But on the whole, the government, just on the policy side, both short-term, long-term, medium-term also, a lot is being done, whether in the social sector. The president in the morning has read out some of the measures, including making education available, affordable to Nigerians through some credit loan scheme that will soon be rolled out. On the health sector, we are looking at nutrition, especially among children, because to correct the stunting notice in some segments of the population, if a child doesn't get adequate nutrition by 3 years, that human capital development is stunted forever. So these are some of the things we are doing. We are developing the bioeconomy value chain to make food available, farm to industry, farm to market. If we can reduce some of the farm-to-market losses we have, even without improved food production, that will be more food at affordable rates for Nigerians. And with respect to revenue gaps, we have some revenue concerns, as the DG budget has read out. In terms of tax, not necessarily are we looking at increasing the taxation, no, but the efficiency in collection of these taxes will bring more to the coffers of government. Also, in the oil sector now contributes single digit to the GDP of the country, recently on the average of 8% of GDP. And nevertheless, it is our major foreign exchange earner. And why is it underperforming? Because of the losses, oil theft, vandalism, and so on. These are another area the government is looking at to improve the economy. Of course, we are looking at the real sector, agriculture. We're also looking at mining. A lot of resources that we have in this country, we are putting attention on it. That's why I say there's short term, there's long time, and there's immediate term things that we are doing. Of course, we are better harnessing of our gas resources. We have a lot of, these are some of the things we are doing. Then on the tax credit scheme, we want to put the government wants to slow it down a bit. Right now, it's over 3 trillion of tax credit scheme, and I think these revenues, we need it more in the coffers of government for the much needed to reduce our deficit and so many other things. In the morning, the CBN governor, he gave us some peep into what they're doing in the monetary side, which in a matter of weeks, it will become public. Also, the Minister of Finance and the Coordinating Minister of Economy on what we're doing at the fiscal side. But like I said, we have to do a budget. This MTEF is also is a precursor to the midterm review of the National Development Plan to further accommodate the Renew Hope agenda. Because in the midterm plan we have, we estimated average GDP growth of 5% for the 5-year period each year. But with the Renew Hope agenda, we want to see how we can attain double-digit growth. These are all work in progress. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, if you have observations on the MTEF and FSP, we can hear it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So as directed, if you have
over to the
observations.
DG budget.
Okay. Okay, the microphone is there with you. Go ahead.
Thank you, DG, for your presentation. Just looking at the macroeconomic framework that you put forward, one of the issues that has plagued the budgetary process in Nigeria and many other African countries is that targets tend to be over-optimistic, particularly revenue targets. And I just would like...
A minute, can you introduce yourself?
Barbara Barungi, Imara Africa Consulting, ex-African Development Bank.
Okay, go ahead.
And one of the things that I'd like to know is what is the contingency plan in the event that, one, oil prices could be volatile and flip the other way, decline, and your revenue projections may not come to fruition. Thank you.
All right. The DG permit. Okay, we take more. So if you have another one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Chinyere Almona. I'm the Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So thank you for this presentation. I think from what you have described, this hopefully should increase the effort to entrench some level of fiscal discipline in the system. But like the last speaker said, there seemed to me to be a lot of optimism in the process. So the question really is, do you think in the short to medium term, we have sufficient time for the planned investment in the social sectors to produce the right level of results that you're looking for? We're looking to invest in education, in agriculture, in all of these sectors. Do you see that we're going to have sufficient time for that result to come through, for it to give you the revenue upscale that you're looking for? Secondly, I see here that the average exchange rate is pegged at about 700 or so. With what the market is saying today, what's the plan to either adjust, or at what point do you think an adjustment will be required for there to be for it to affect the revenue projection? Finally, there's an effort to address issues of security and oil theft. We've been hearing about the effort to deal with security and oil theft forever. Now, if we're putting our hopes on the outcome of that effort in increasing our production levels, how do you see that affecting the real result at the end of the day?
Thank you. We'll take the third one.
Good evening. My name is Victor Morocco, Chairman, Fiscal Responsibility Commission. I want to honestly commend the President, the FGN economic team, particularly of the budget and planning team. The DG have obviously stated and shown great improvement in compliance with Fiscal Responsibility Act. Taking this public consultation to this upscale is part of what compliance should be. I want to commend the DG, the Honorable Minister of Budget and National Planning, we should sustain this approach in compliance with FRA, because it's one key law that, if combined with the present efforts of the economic team of Mr. President, I think we'll get there. I can see from all the key assumptions there's greater hope, and I think it's part of the hope renewed agenda. But we should not take things for granted. The key assumptions, particularly the revenue targets, will not come easy. There's also a need to cut costs. We need to show greater sacrifice in the area of transparency. Most of the government-owned enterprises should also come to this party sincerely so that these efforts can be real. Because looking at the previous efforts, you find out that the key assumptions previously, as in, even in 2022-23, government made efforts, but how did we get there? So that, moving forward, if most of these government-owned enterprises can appreciate these efforts, I think there are a lot of revenues out there which, if properly harnessed, will meet the revenue target of the federal government. On that note, I want to commend the efforts once again and to say that all hands must be on deck. And further, there are other issues. What Mr. President is saying about the laws, the efforts of the Fiscal and Tax Reform Committee, these are obvious push to see that we improve. And we should sustain it. It cannot be Mr. President tax alone. We are all stakeholders, and we must all gather together to move our country forward. Thank you.
We have a few questions at the back. We'll quickly take this online. Jeremiah Adamu wrote, what is the FGN doing to collect all the budgeted revenue given the massive evasion of taxes? How will the revenue targets be met? Simon Fashanu wrote, under 6.24, how could the budget deficit of about 53% of total FGN revenue be reduced? This ratio is high and unhealthy for economic growth. And finally, from the online, Nabila Mohammed wrote, what will be the source of borrowing for the deficit? Will it be largely domestic or foreign, or a combination of both? If the DG takes this set of questions, then if we have time, we'll be able to take the next set from behind. DG, sir.
Thank you. Well, Barbara, you know, when you look at the trend historically, and you just look at in terms of what percentage revenues have been collected, you might, you know, it will seem to be valid that the projections have been overly optimistic. But if you actually drill down and look at the actual numbers, I don't think that these numbers can be said to be unrealistic. So take, for instance, 2023. We projected oil production of 1.6 million barrels per day. Is that an unrealistic? The fact that, you know, up to July, actual is 1.37 million barrels. Does that make 1.6 million barrels an unrealistic level? For a country that had previously produced 2.4 million barrels per day, and where the technical capacity to do way above 1.6 million exists, and where even our OPEC quota. So we need to understand that the budget is a tool, and it's a tool to drive performance in the desired direction. If all we do is say, okay, all right, just so that our budget can look realistic, we set oil production at 1.3 million barrels per day. That I don't think will be, the way, to go. So it's to say, look at the actual whatever before you get to the outturns. Does 1.6 million barrels make sense? The price of $75, does it make sense vis-a-vis the market? Look at even the projections for non-oil taxes. Again, the fact that they are coming in over, again, except custom duty, which is one that, we are dealing down now to find out what is the explanation, because ordinarily, even just by exchange rate effect, custom duties, should be this thing. But it surprised you that as we drill down, we found that one of the explanations was somebody needs to prompt action to, the rate at which duties are computed is not automatically adjusted. So the last time somebody signed off on the rate to apply for duties was 429 naira. And even when exchange rate in the market had moved that, somebody was basing duty at 429, whatever, So these are all things that, unless you have that draws attention to your own performance, people are not going to. Budgets are not intended to be a walk in the park. There's, budgets are designed to be aspirational. But the key point you made is what contingency plans where actuals don't. The first thing, of course, is you look at your expenditures. Expenditures broadly categorized into discretionary and non-discretionary. So when revenues don't come in as projected, you take another look at your discretionary expenditures. And so if you take in the first 7 months, for instance, where revenues were at 80% of budget, when I showed the numbers there, I showed that spending also had basically slowed down, and which is why, as of end of July, we have a fiscal deficit that is only 50% of the level that had been projected. But again, when that becomes, sustained over time, then you have to, revisit your entire, budget, assumptions. Dr. Almona, you said these projections reflect a lot of optimism. Again, I doubt it. In fact, we have been told pointedly that our outlook is very pessimistic by, some other. We had the similar consultation with the Nigerian Economic Council, who presented these same numbers. The National Economic Council, and the verdict was that our outlook was overly pessimistic. But here you are, you say it is overly optimistic. So that may indeed suggest that we are getting it right. But in terms of, say, where there's sufficient time for the investments in the social sector to impact. Indeed, the investments in the social sector, those are not, they are not, the results are not, don't come in annual cycles, and they're not really, what you see here is spending yet. Over medium term, then we expect the results. So the improvements in outturns are not directly hinged on the increased spending. What we're saying is there's a need for government to spend more on those sectors in the medium term, and indeed over the long term, to be able to address all of the poor human development indices that we see. The exchange rate, as I explained earlier, we don't really worry about this. So we've made the budget based on 700 and the actual turns out to be 800. It just represents an upside. Okay, your dollar revenues will be monetized at the applicable I&E rate in the course of the year. They will not be monetized at your budget rate. And so the difference between the actual rate at which they get monetized and the budget rate will simply reflect as some exchange, gain you may. Confronting oil theft, you said we've been talking about this and not much result coming out of it, and therefore, should we continue? Again, that's the question. Should we then accept oil theft as given and resign ourselves to, okay, oil theft will happen, therefore not this thing, or should we say, that, based on the oil theft will be tackled, and if it's tackled, this will be the outcome. And so if those outcomes are, then it keeps the focus on the action that needs to be taken to think up. But again, the truth is that there has been some improvement. Earlier in the year, we got as low as 1 million barrels per day and below. So to say that there's been no improvement is actually not correct. Welcome, Honorable Minister.
A quick recognition of the Honorable Minister of Budget and Economic Planning. Please welcome distinguished Senator Abubakar Atiku Bagudu, Commander of the Niger. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Honorable Minister, we'll finish the presentation and some first round of questions. So I'll just need that. I suspect some of them may have reserved some tougher questions for you. So, okay. So, Chairman FRC. You and us are on the same side, so we welcome the commendation. But you make the point about the need even to tighten the controls over the expenditure of government-owned enterprises. And that's what we're doing. As we've moved from using administrative now to legal measures to try and rein that in. Now, by law, these organizations are required to limit their expenditure to revenue ratios to 50%. And we've moved from them voluntarily remitting their operating surpluses to the Treasury, to the Treasury having direct access to their accounts at the central bank now to basically, debit those accounts for surpluses that are due to Treasury. And, so these are some of the measures that are, being taken. From the online audience, what is government doing to collect taxes from the past, the backlog given high incidence of tax evasion? Truth is, if we knew those who have evaded taxes, we would be on their case, of course. But FIRS has a procedure for back audits, and they are intensifying these audits. There are lots of cases pending in the Tax Appeal Tribunal. If these cases went in our favor, there will be a few trillions of naira, being, recovered from people who the audit reviews have indicated that they underpaid taxes, in the past. So person else asked, how could the deficit be reduced further? Because 53% of 50% revenue to GDP, deficit to revenue ratio. We agree with you that, typically when a government begins to spend more than 30% of its revenues on debt service, then, that is indicative of trouble. So we agree that 50%, but as I said earlier, we've been as realistic as possible in these projections based on the current situation. As I indicated earlier also, there is an ongoing process under the leadership of the Honorable Minister for Budget and Economic Planning to basically review all our things and plans to align them with the greater ambition and of the new administration. And as these come to fruition, we would revisit this. I mentioned earlier that over the medium term, the goal is to try and bring the budget deficit within the 3% threshold. But there's no point, the only way to show that sort of picture that you're advocating now is one, either to show higher revenues, where some people already think the revenues are very ambitious, or to show lower expenditures. Again, when you look at the projected expenditures, by the time you take debt service and take personnel costs, which are, largely non-discretionary, you're already accounting for a very significant percentage of the, projected expenditure. So in terms of the leeway to cut on spending, and if it is said that at our current level of public investment, that it will take us, several decades, or centuries to fix our infrastructure gap, then slowing down spending on public infrastructure isn't, again, the solution. So the way we see it as a solution is to, focus on growing revenues. We need to be spending a lot more money than these numbers indicate, not less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG sir. I've been informed that plenary is about to start, and as such, I'm told we may not be able to take more questions, but all questions are to be directed to the email of the Budget Office, and the Minister will now speak to conclude this session for plenary to begin. We now welcome to the microphone the Honorable Minister of Budget and Economic Planning, Distinguished Senator Abubakar Atiku Bagudu, Commander of the Niger, CON.
How do I on it? Okay. Thank you very much, all the stakeholders, the Permanent Secretary, the DG Budget, and directors. I believe that in my absence, the DG did a good job. That because we had to go for the Federal Executive Council, and to thank all of you for coming and for sharing your opinions. One of the major objectives of this public consultation is to give confidence that what you say matters, and secondly, to call attention to all those, particularly revenue agencies and implementing agencies, that the public have an expectation that we should do better, in the sense that we should generate more revenues, we should ensure expenditure efficiency, because this influences the allocation decisions of our private sector and many other developmental partners, and indeed the wider investing public. So we assure you that we will do better. That this medium-term expenditure framework public consultation is taking place in the midst of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group is also an important, it's a noteworthy coincidence, because earlier today, both the President Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, spoke about the macroeconomic reforms undertaken so far, to the challenges that he acknowledged, and roll out measures, mention that measures have been taken, and subsequently, both the coordinating Minister of the Economy and the Minister of Finance, and indeed the Governor of the Central Bank, spoke to some of those measures. We are not only under any illusion that we need heavy lifting, particularly in the next year, and therefore we are committed to the budget so that the private sector with certainty can say this is what the federal government is committed to doing. And we know that it is such commitment that will encourage the private sector to do all the commendable things they have indicated that they will do. We are optimistic that we can generate more growth than anticipated or in the National Development Plan. And indeed, that is what the messaging in the Renewed Hope agenda. However, we are guided by protocols of the medium-term expenditure framework, and maybe, as explained by the Director General, that is why we have a conservative outlook, which we believe will anchor the 2024 budget in a very consistent, clear, plan-related budget that will be, as much as possible, be adhered to. I thank you very much for all your inputs, and I'm sure the DG will brief you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. And with that, the side events here is closed. The NESG continues at the Congress Hall, and lunch is served for participants here just outside. You are advised to participate in lunch before you go. Thank you very much. Lunch is served. Again, remember that for all participants here, lunch is served just at the lobby. Thank you.